Today, we are talking about Aruba SD-Branch. This is Worldwide Technology, hands-on live lab podcast. What we're hoping today is cover through many different aspects of SD-Branch. My name is Brandon Swag with your host today. If you have any questions, please post them in the WebEx throughout the chat, and I'm going to do my best to relay them. So without further ado, I want to introduce today's guest, Scott Boda.
Good morning. Thanks, Brandon. I want to welcome everybody to the Aruba SD-Branch with CX, ECS, and Aruba Central live lab. We'll talk about a lot of things SD-Branch today. I know that this is billed as Aruba, but we're going to have a conversation about SD-Branch in general throughout this conversation. So a little bit about myself is I've been at Worldwide, I'll be at Worldwide 8 years in August. I've been with ASD in solutions development with labs and learning for the past 4 years. My primary function is to create labs and learning for all you folks out there so you can learn about the technologies like Aruba SD-Branch and routing and switching and wireless and some of the other technology that we have out there. Prior to Worldwide, like many others, I spent some time at Cisco, a total of 15 years and 2 tours. I actually joined Cisco in March of 2005. I believe it was March 25th, 2005 from the airspace acquisition. Not that I'm keeping track of that. But throughout the years, I'm not going to go date myself because if I did, I would tell you that back when everybody lived in a cave and we had dirt floors and rocks for chairs, that's about the time I got into the business. I started out in mainframe, and that is why to this very day, I only type with 6 fingers. So I spent the startup years. If you look at my resume back in the 2000s, it probably looked like a roadmap of Texas. So I landed at Worldwide, and it's been a great experience, and I hope that you enjoy today's content. And what we'll do is we'll do a quick agenda overview. So we'll get into what we're actually going to go over today. We're going to go into a generalized conversation about SD-Branch. We'll get into some specifics about Aruba, but we want to talk about why we actually did the SD-Branch learning path and learning series content. And there are several different reasons for that. And we'll show you exactly why we did what we did and how we did it.
So let's take a second there to kind of level set, because we've been tossing out the term SD-Branch. So SD-Branch stands for Software Defined Branch. I myself have asked ChatGPT, what is your definition of Software Defined Branch? And we can go to many different OEMs, and I think the definition varies. So let me just kind of level set. When you say Software Defined Branch, what is Software Defined Branch or SD-Branch in your eyes, Scott?
Well, so to me, and your mileage is going to vary depending upon your particular topology and your policies and how you're set up. So my definition of SD-Branch may not be the same as everybody else's definition of SD-Branch. However, my definition really consists of 3 basic parts outside of having a central management platform, is being able to manage your SD-WAN connections as well as your switching as well as your wireless. Now, the 4th piece of that is also security, but depending upon your OEM, if you look at Aruba, some of the security pieces are covered in the SD-Branch rollout. Some of them are not. But I think SD-Branch is basically the ability to have a central repository for policy, to be able to distribute policy to all your different branches and to be able to configure all of your different branches and all of the different technologies within the branches from a central location. So you have it, and I hate using the term single pane of glass, but that's basically what it is. So you have from a single spot where you can touch all of your branches, whether it be a data center, whether it be an HA branch, whether it be a small branch. Maybe you have 1,000 small branches and you want to configure them the same way. You would be able to do that from a central cloud managed platform.
That makes sense. And let's continue to take that step back a second. I know you've had experience in not just Aruba SD-Branch, but with some of the other vendors, partners along the way. In your experience, what are some of the major differences across all the different SD-Branch solutions?
Well, I think it really starts with management. Now, we worked with 3 different OEMs, Aruba being one of them, in the SD-Branch learning series. And I think that how you manage the branches and how you manage policy is different for each OEM. When you look at Aruba, you have Aruba Central, but you also have the Aruba Orchestrator, which is a separate management platform for the ECS or SilverPeak appliances. So when you look at management in general, yes, they're all cloud managed in one way, shape, or form, but Aruba's got 2 different management platforms because the orchestrator is not actually incorporated into Central quite yet. When you look at some of the other OEMs, depending upon what you're doing, some of them are easier to manage. Some of them are more difficult to manage. Some of them are plug and play and they sort of show up in your dashboard. And some of them require pre-configuration for them to show up in your dashboard. Let's take the Aruba ECS SilverPeak appliances, for example. You have to work with your channel guys to create a tenant in the orchestrator, and that tenant creates a tenant key. When you get the SilverPeak appliances, after you order them, they come pre-configured with that tenant and that tenant key, so they'll show up in your tenant when you log in, and then you can accept them. If they're not configured, when they get to you, then you have to touch each individual client and individual device, and you have to add that tenant and that tenant key. Otherwise, once you plug it in, it'll get DHCP and it'll show up in your tenant, and you can accept it as a device within a tenant. So I think a lot of the differences start with the management platforms, but as you move across the different appliances that are managed by SD-Branch, they differ there too.
So before we start to dig into some of the management plane and the controllers and policies being pushed down, I like to ask this question with all of our hands on is, what is the biggest surprise that came to you while you're building out this learning path on WFT.com?
Well, I think the biggest surprise to me is how different they are when you get into the cloud managed platform and the complexity that it takes to actually configure things. Let's take Aruba and Aruba Central from a switching perspective. The CX switches are manageable from Aruba Central, but there's some things that you cannot manage on the CX switches. So they have to be pre-configured. And we'll get, for example, like OSPF. So you have to do some CLI configuration, and you have to do some CLI configuration on the switches anyway for them to be able to get an IP address and then be able to contact the Aruba Central portal. With that said, I think that when you talk about a couple of the other vendors, one is simply plug and play. It gets an IP address, and then if you know the serial number, you simply put the serial number in and it pops up into your inventory. Another uses a claim code, which is the size of a postage stamp on the back of each appliance, and it's very, very hard to see. But you have to have that claim code in order to actually bring it into the inventory. So they're all sort of similar in the way that you bring appliances in, but some of them require CLI configuration. Some of them do not require CLI configuration. One vendor in particular doesn't even have a CLI. So it's really pretty simple.
Makes sense. So with that, let's continue to dive in here a little bit. Do you mind showing us how to get to the learning path on WWT.com? And let's remind everybody they can launch and go along as Scott does here in the learning path. You must be a customer or partner of WWT.com to launch the lab. After this event, you will also have the lab to tinker and play with as well. So if you have any questions, again, please drop them in the WebEx chat. So do you mind showing us how to get to the learning path?
Absolutely. I don't mind, but absolutely I'll show you. You have to have an account on WWT.com, and you actually have to be a customer in Salesforce to be able to access the lab content. But correct me if I'm wrong here. If you're actually part of this hands-on, you'll have access to the labs for, I think, 30 days.
That's correct.
After that, you have to be a registered customer with Worldwide or a registered partner. So once you're on the Worldwide homepage, which is wwt.com, you'd sign in, and then of course you can go to my account and you can show my events, and this will show you what events you have coming up and what events you can join. This shows you that the hands-on lab is today, the webinar is today, and it's live now. However, if you're looking for labs and content, especially if you're looking for, say, Aruba SD-Branch, you would simply go to the search bar and you'd click on Aruba SD-Branch and you'd search for Aruba SD-Branch. And it would bring up a lot of Aruba SD-Branch content along with other SD-Branch content. Now, wwt.com is a almost endless repository of technical information, white papers and labs and videos and tutorials. So anything that you really want to know technically, routing protocols, SD-WAN, different types of technologies. There's something out there for everybody. But if you search Aruba SD-Branch and then you go into learning, what you'll see is the learning paths. Here's the learning series. So this is the Aruba SD-Branch with CX, ECS, and Aruba Central learning series. Now, this particular learning series has two parts to it, and there are two learning paths within the series. There is the Aruba SD-Branch CX and wireless with Aruba Central, and there is the Aruba SD-WAN with Aruba ECS SilverPeak learning path. If you go into the learning series, it'll bring up the series and you can go into each one of these individually and start the learning paths. So you can start them from there. If you don't want to do both, you can simply go back and you can click individually on the learning paths. Now, when you break the learning paths down, you'll see that there's a lot of different content within the learning path. And you go through it all when you start learning. You go through it all and you'll end up at the lab at the bottom. And then there's a conclusion that has a quiz that'll ask you 10 questions. And if you have to get 80% of them right, and then you'll get a badge saying you successfully completed this learning path. So each one of these each one of the learning paths and learning series contains at least two paths. One of the first vendors we did actually has 3 different learning paths because we split wireless out, but we collapsed wireless into the Aruba learning path. So it's really very simple. You just click on it, you start learning, and it'll take you through all these different pieces of the learning path. Now, when we start talking about the technology, I just want to throw this out there, is that this is based upon my experience of creating these learning paths. This is not an advocation for a particular solution. This is not an admonition of any particular technology. What this is my opinion and my experience. And we talked about this 100 times. If anybody has seen a commercial on TV, at the bottom, at the end, somebody says really, really fast, opinions expressed here do not necessarily express the opinions of management or this radio station. That is what this is. So what we talk about here today does not necessarily reflect how you would roll this technology out. That's why we have sales teams, and that's why we have engineers to help you do that, to provide the best solution that you can. It may not necessarily be a single vendor.
Yeah, you make a really great point. Is what we've done here, and I'm going to ask you to show the topology here, is we've put a lot of work into depicting as many different deployment scenarios when it comes to SD-Branch or SD-WAN, switching, wireless, all coming together. We put a lot into it, but deployment patterns vary, requirements vary, so some of this will vary as we go into it. Would you mind taking a few minutes to look at what is the topology? You briefly mentioned the lab inside of these learning paths. And I think the lab was something we started with very early when creating this content to give consumers this apples to apples comparison experience. So, do you mind taking a few minutes and walking us through the lab topology itself?
Sure. And that is one of the things I think is most important here, because what we did is we built the learning series, all 3 learning series, around the exact same topology. And this is what it looks like. So the topology consists of 2 data centers, 2 ISPs, a high availability branch where you have high availability in the core switches, and then you have some distribution switches underneath with some wireless controllers and some wireless access points, as well as a small branch. So we try to be representative of what you might see in the real world. And we built this specifically and with save one vendor that allows you to actually monitor some of their other switching and wireless technology without it actually being part of the dashboard. But we wanted to see how the vendors reacted in the same scenario, whether it be HA on the edge, whether it be routing, whether it be tunneling between the branches, or what have you. So we tried to compare each OEM and put them into the same scenario, put them into the exact same situation, and see how they reacted and see how easy it was to actually configure it and how it came out. And mileage may vary there too. So there are some vendors that were easy to configure, and there are some vendors that are not so easy to configure. Take for example, the Aruba ECS appliances have a active HA on the edge. There are other vendors that have active HA on the edge, and there's also a vendor that if you have multiple ISPs, you cannot do active on the edge. You can only do it if you have a single ISP. So they have a virtual IP address you have to use, which pretty much lets out having multiple vendors, because 2 different vendors are certainly not going to give you the same IP addressing space. So we found out a lot of things as we tried to configure all of the vendors the same way for the same topology. And we learned a lot as we did this, because they differ when you roll them out.
Makes sense. Do you mind taking a few minutes? Let's dive into Orchestrator and to Aruba Central and take a look at these different management planes. So this lab, again, is available to everybody that enrolls into the learning path. At the very bottom, there's several videos to walk through, and there's the lab at the bottom. Again, we're trying to keep it apples to apples across multiple, so search SD-Branch on wwt.com to see all the different examples. But today, we're going to zoom now very much into the Aruba solution.
So this is the Aruba Orchestrator, and it does have 2-factor authentication. So I'm already logged in, because it either sends you an email or you have to use the Google Authenticator to generate a code, and it takes a while to do that. So I've already logged in, but this is basically the overview page of the Aruba Orchestrator. And as you can see, we have it broken down into Data Center 1, Data Center 2, the HA branch, and then the small branch. Now, we have the locations for the data centers that are sitting here in St. Louis. So DC1 and DC2 are both in the same location. So you see 4 appliances there, and you see 4 appliances here. The HA branch is located in New York. There's 2 appliances sitting here, and there's also 2 appliances sitting in the New York location. When you look at the small branch that's sitting in Tampa, that's where I'm from. So I figured, why not? So that's where we have the small branch. Now, the configuration part of this is fairly straightforward. You can highlight them all, and you can go into configuration. Say you want to configure OSPF, and it will bring up all the appliances, and then you can configure each one of these appliances for OSPF. You can also do different things. You can configure, go into deployments to configure HA. So if you want to configure HA on the edge, you simply select the DC1 ECS appliance, and you click this little box that says Edge HA, and then you pick your pair. As long as the WAN 1 connections are together, it'll form an HA pair, and it'll actually generate an auto address here for your HA link. So you don't have, you can change that if you want, but there's no need to, because they're not routable addresses. So this is basically how you configure your devices in the Aruba Orchestrator. So it's really pretty straightforward. You can do a lot of different things from the orchestrator. You can do some security policies. Now, we'll talk a little bit about security for the ECS appliance. The ECS appliance is not classified as a next generation firewall. So that's one of the things we've learned. You can do some north, south, east, west firewalling. It does have some IDS, IPS capability. It does some packet inspection, but it doesn't have malware protection and it doesn't do SSL decryption. So depending upon what your security posture is and what your topology is and what your end goals are, having an ECS appliance on the edge may or may not fulfill your security needs. And if you are the SD-WAN organizer or the SD-WAN engineer, or if you're an infrastructure engineer and you have a security team, they might have something to say about that. So keep in mind that it's not a full-blown firewall. Now, there are other vendors out there. One of the other vendors that we dealt with is very much akin to the ECS. It's not a full-blown firewall. The third vendor, depending upon how you license it, with some advanced licensing and some additional products laid on top, is classified as a next generation firewall. So I think that's where SD-Branch comes in when you start talking about the edge. So the edge is really important depending upon what your security posture is and what your security needs are.
That makes sense. And when you say edge, it is the SD-WAN. It is the WAN devices that are sitting on the outside.
Correct.
Internet facing, if you would. Do you mind taking a second and showing us what the security or firewall configuration looks like in the solution?
Well, you can set firewall zones, north, south, east, west. You can create firewall definitions. You can add them. You can add zones to the firewall definitions. You can actually look at the IDS, IPS and turn it on or turn it off. Right now, we actually have it turned off. It is eligible for IDS, IPS, but you can see it's disabled. And it'll take you into the signature profiles. So you can look at some of the signatures and some of the rules that are actually there. So this is part of the security that's built into the ECS appliance. But again, it's limited to what it can and cannot do.
Makes sense. And you've talked quite a bit about the orchestrator or the WAN portion. And in the early stage, you talked about Aruba Central as monitoring the switches and the wireless. You mind open up Aruba Central and talking through that, what's available inside of this lab?
Sure. So what Aruba's done is basically has put Central under HPE's GreenLake platform. So when you sign in, you're actually signing into GreenLake. I actually have my credentials cached here, and they're also cached in the lab for the most part, but it gives you the username and the password when you actually have to log in. And it'll take you to your workspace. When you log into this particular lab with the lab user, there's only one workspace, and it'll take you directly to that workspace. I happen to have two, but this is the Aruba SD-Branch with CX and ECS workspace, and that'll take you into GreenLake for this particular, for the ECS and the CX and wireless piece. This is where you'd add your device inventory. So if you want to add your devices, you'll need the serial number and the MAC address. So when you add devices and you look at device inventory, you can see all the devices that are here. If you want to add a device, you can add a networking device. But again, you're going to need the serial number and the MAC address. It makes it a little bit difficult for the APs because the console on the APs is proprietary. So it's a little bit different. So as long as you have all of that information, you can simply add all the devices that you want to add. Once you have your devices added, then you have to add your subscriptions to actually make them valid for Aruba Central. So when you look at the subscriptions that are here, I'm not sure why they're not showing up. They were there yesterday, but that's what happens when you go live. So we can look at it. We'll see if we can find the devices. There they are. So it tells you how many subscriptions you have applied and to which devices. So that's how you actually manage your devices and how you add them to GreenLake. And that's how you would actually be able to work with them in Central once they're added to GreenLake. Now, Aruba in Central has changed things up a little bit. And they rolled out a version of the new Central, and you can see right here it says public preview. So it's not a whole lot you can actually do here. But if you take the slider and you bring it back and you say we're going to go use the old Central, that is where this is what everybody is used to that's seen Aruba Central. And you can look at all the devices that you have. This is globally, so you'll see all the access points, small branch AP, HA branch APs. Here are all the switches, and you can see that all the switches are AOS CX and the mobility gateways. If you want to go and configure any part of this, you would have to go into the actual branch. And if you want to configure access points or configure an SSID, you click on config and you simply add an SSID. It's really very simple. Now, what's really nice about Central, as opposed to anybody that's actually worked with Aruba when they're doing mobility masters and mobility controllers, is you have to create a cluster if you have more than one mobility controller, and you have to do it manually. What's nice about Central is for each group you create and the devices that are in the groups, it actually configures the cluster automatically for you. So you don't have to do it manually. And it's really very nice because that way the APs are spread across the cluster if you have more than one mobility gateway. For switches, it's a little bit different because when you config for the switches, it's going to give you a dashboard. And you can see that there's not a whole lot of options here. You can do some link aggregation depending upon what you're trying to do. Link aggregation and VSX don't work so well together when you're doing layer 3. So we actually eliminated link aggregation and used a routing protocol to take care of traffic between the core switches and the ECS appliances. But if you do a multi-edit, you have the ability to look at all of the switches. So it really depends on what you're trying to do. If you go into each switch, you can edit the config, but it's going to be through the CLI. So what we did is we actually pre-configured the core switches and the distribution switches for OSPF and then added them to Central. Because if you add them to Central and there's no pre-configuration, it's going to erase the configuration that's on the switch. So we built it, and when we added it to Central, it pops up and says, hey, do you want to maintain this configuration? Oh, absolutely, because I just spent X amount of time configuring this for OSPF to talk to the ECS appliances and the distribution switches to talk to the core switches. So we want to keep those configurations. For the gateways, it allows you to do configuration on the gateways. There are some things you can do. You can create VLANs if you like. You can do DHCP pool management. You can play with GRE tunnels. You can play with routing. There's a little bit of security that you can do as well. So you can create some security rules. It works a lot like the standalone version of the Mobility Master and the mobility controllers. So the security is pretty much the same as it is if you had a standalone without Central.
We've got a couple questions here in chat. So first, the lab itself, is everybody sharing the same topology? So you do have a read-only experience in the lab to kind of go through. But in the chat here, Todd's asking some questions around templates. And I think you kind of alluded to that. You absorbed a device into Central that was pre-configured. Do you mind taking a few minutes to talk about templates and how would they be applied? Maybe if they're adopted via Aruba Central, maybe if they're imported via CLI. What do templates look like in the different configurations?
Well, since we didn't use templates to configure any of this, that's a question and something that we have to get into and talk a little bit more about, because the templates that you would use are not necessarily applicable to every single device. Like you wouldn't be able to apply a template like that to a CX switch. So that's sort of a difficult question to answer.
Okay. You mind take a second and talk about CX switches compared to the AOS switches?
So CX is Aruba's new version of switches. They run a completely different OS than the AOS, so they run OS CX. They are a newer switch, faster switch. They have more options. They have more AI intelligence in them, and they're moving from the old AOS switches into CX. So they're trying to push everybody into CX. So CX is the newer version of the older switches.
Okay. In your experience, so you mentioned that you started with CLI and absorbed and didn't use templates. Why specifically did you not? What did you use CLI to configure, for example, the HA branch?
Well, for different things like VSX, you don't have the option to configure VSX from Central, at least that I have found. So VSX is basically Aruba's CX version of switch stacking. So it's high availability, but it's actually a switch stack, and they act in concert with each other. So they work in peers. So if one goes down, the other takes the traffic load. So that's VSX is something that is not an option in the dashboard. So you had to actually configure that and then bring it into Central. Just like OSPF, if you looked at the CX switches in Central, and we'll take another quick look here. If you go into config, you don't really have the option of configuring OSPF. You can configure static routing, you can configure some other things. So we pre-configured OSPF because we didn't have the option to be able to do it. You'd have to do it through the CLI anyway, at least that I've found. So that's why we did it that way.
And that's for the HA branch. How about for the non-HA branch, that single non-high availability branch? Did you configure that through templates or through CLI?
We did it. We all the CX switches were done through CLI.
Okay.
All of the ECS appliances were done through the orchestrator. All of the gateways had a CLI configuration on them. You actually have to configure them to auto-register to Aruba Central. And we configured the VLANs up front. Although you could configure the VLANs through Aruba Central, we did it through the CLI. It was just simpler that way.
Makes sense. And a user, Travis, has a question in chat, and I'm not sure I totally understand the context, so I'm gonna do my best, Travis. But sites are a requirement in New Central. Can you some time and talk about sites within Aruba Central?
Well, sure. So if you look at the New Central, it'll show you that there's no site, that you have 12 devices that have a site requirement. Now, right now you can't actually do that in the public preview of Central, but if you go back out to GreenLake, you can create sites and then move your devices into the sites. So if you go back to GreenLake, let me go back into Central here real quick, and then we'll go to groups because it'll be under groups.
I think you're getting to exactly Travis's answer. Is he was trying to configure sites in the New Central, and your question, and the answer is
right
sites
now
are configured in GreenLake.
Well, so sites are configured actually through Central, but in the New Central, you don't have the option to be able to configure them. At least I haven't found it yet. But here's where you would create sites in Central, and then you would just import them into when you rolled out New Central, it would just be imported here. So you create a new site, it'll ask you what the site name is, a street address, city, country, and so on and so forth. Once you have the site created, you just drag and drop whatever appliances you have into the site, and then it'll show up on the map. We didn't actually create sites here, we just created groups, and that's another thing that's interesting about this. Is you have a lot of different pieces that you can configure when you roll out these appliances. So what we did is we broke it down, and we created different groups for each data center, for the HA branch and the small branch, and then we added the appliances to the group. So you can see in the HA branch you have access points, you have gateways, and you have switches. So it actually tells you what is in each branch. But from a site perspective, if we go into the new central, and we're going to be doing this sort of on the fly here, if you go into the new central, you can't actually create the site here yet. What you can do is assign them if it'll let you, but it doesn't really let, because it's a public preview, so there's not a whole lot you can do there. So you would actually do it through the old central, and then when you roll it into the new central, it would be assigned to a site.
Gotcha. And I'm going to put you on the spot. What is the timeline for new central?
I've heard anywhere between August and October, but they've been rolling it out to different locations and different customers. So some customers have access to it. We just don't happen to be one of them right now. So I had heard September. I was actually surprised when I got the email. It's on May 23rd that said we're rolling out New Central. But again, if you look at it, it says customer preview, so it doesn't really give you the option to do a whole lot of things.
Yeah, well, I have a question for the audience as you go through here. So there's quite a bit we've covered, from Orchestrator to Aruba Central to GreenLake, and this is our first Aruba SD-Branch learning series and lab we've put on the platform on WWT.com. Question for you guys is, I'd love some inspiration. Which way would you like to see this content go? Is there an area we can expand upon? Which are challenges or something you're looking at from an organization? I need to know deeper into the segmentation side of things. Can I do east-west? How can I manage all these different access points or switches? So question for you guys, if I put you in the creator seat, how would you like to see this learning series go as we start to build on additional content from this lab? Okay. With that, I'm going to ask you why they respond in chat. Is, let's say I have my troubleshooting hat on and I've got a call in. What does this start to look like now that I have everything from a switches and an access point in one window and my WAN in the other? What are some things you start to look at if you were a network operations center getting the first trouble call in?
Well, I want to know what location it is first. So again, you can go into each location and you can look at your clients, you can look at the security, you can look at alerts and events. Since we don't have any clients right now that are attached to the wireless, you can look at the configurations for the APs, whether you have which radios are on, that kind of thing. You can look at radio policy. If you want to look at the radios, you want to see what the default radio policy is, what channels you're using, that sort of thing. So there are a lot of different options that you have to look to see what's actually going on, depending upon what the problem is. If it's a routing issue, again, you probably are going to need access to either the CLI or some of the tools that they have, which are fairly limited to console when you look at these devices.
Makes sense. So another question, kind of behind the scenes. I'm going to preface this as a behind the scenes question. While you were building out, so as you built out this lab, and we're building out labs, so parallel can consumption take place and user one doesn't step on user two, or what sort of challenges did you run into? What was your surprise when setting up some of this stuff?
Well, I think the issue is that because of the way that this lab is constructed, and it's got two parts to it. One is a VM part, which allows you to do the virtual lab host, and you can have as many people as you want launch that virtual lab host and get into Central. You're not limited to the number of people that can log in. What you are limited to is the fact that there's one set of hardware. So if you have 10 users all logged in, going through the lab, all changing different things on the same set of hardware, it makes life a little bit difficult, and it can break a lot of things. So I think the biggest challenge that we had is, how do we put this out there and allow people to go through it, which is why I think we suggest that you go through the learning path to get to the lab, because the learning path will take you through how we created everything, showing you how we configured OSPF, showing you how we created VSX, showing you how we accepted and configured OSPF on the ECS devices, and then take the labs, because the labs are really a mirror of the learning path itself. So I think the biggest challenge is to create an environment where people can actually learn, but you're limited to what they can actually do if you have multiple people in there at one time.
Makes sense. So the question to the chat about what kind of inspiration can we have for future content? There's definitely a trend around operations, and I know it's something we've talked about is building I guess we'll build a lab and then intentionally break it and try and find the troubleshooting scenario that makes sense. So I guess in a general fashion, what we have now is if you were in operations and your goal was to monitor and manage performance of this Aruba orchestrator and Aruba, what screens would you click on day one? If you're sitting down in the network operations center to manage and monitor, what would you look on to say, this is my screen that I would look and assess my WAN health, and vice versa for LAN?
Well, so you do have some AI insights here, okay? And that's new. So if you look at the YouTube video, it'll tell you there's up-down connectivity, there's connection experiences, there's WAN health screens that'll tell you what the health, especially if you have your sites up. It'll also give you a network health of everything that's out there, and it'll give you a summary. So it'll tell you what your bandwidth utilization is. It'll tell you what your overall utilization is, how many clients you have, and the client count per network. So there are a lot of things you can look at when you have clients connected to it.
Agree. So would you do that in Aruba Central, or would you do that in Orchestrator?
Well, that's an interesting question too. From an SD-WAN perspective, you're sort of locked into doing it through the orchestrator. The WAN health is going to be not dependent upon what happens in the ECS appliances. So it's not really going to give you any WAN information. You'd have to go into the orchestrator, and the orchestrator has a little graph at the bottom that tells you everything that it tests out. So it goes out and reaches out to a bunch of different sites and tells you if you actually have a problem that's out there, any latency or anything that's out there. And it gives you a list of top talkers. And if you have a problem, say the tunnels go down, and that's one of the nice things about the ECS appliances as well, is as long as they know about each other and they're in the tenant, they will form tunnels automatically to each of the ECS appliances. And they will inject routes into the SD-WAN fabric so that any interfaces that are locally attached to the ECS appliances will be visible to every other branch. And that's something that all of the other vendors did not do. You actually have to build the tunnels, or do a template to build the tunnels, or you have to create a mesh VPN.
What is that? You mind showing us where that is in the screen of Orchestrator to build my mesh?
Well, it actually does it automatically. So you can actually go in and look. Let me find it here and go and look at your tunnels. And it has a couple of different ones, but this shows you, I did not build these tunnels. I built them on their own. So this is not something that I did. Again, when it knows that they're in the same tenant, it automatically brings the tunnels up.
Is that, if that's partial mesh, full mesh, what kind of tunnel mesh?
So if you look at where the tunnels go from the, say, DC1 ECSA, you're looking at different overlay and underlay tunnels. So there's the small branch, there's the HA branch, there's DC2. So it is a full mesh between all of the appliances, and it automatically configures itself.
So kind of closing out here, I just want to be respectful of everybody's time here. As everybody, there's quite a few people that are new to Aruba Central, or I'll just say new to Aruba in general. Of course, we recommend starting with the learning path, and they've gave some great inspiration on where we should take this learning path beyond the initial one. But what are some other pieces of content you'd recommend they consume to become a Arubec?
Well, I'd certainly go out to Aruba.com first. I'd start there. I mean, that's probably the first place. But having a relationship with a WWT technical team, okay, that helps you support your infrastructure and your WAN is another great place to start. Having a relationship with your Aruba channel team is also a great place to start. We relied heavily on the the SilverPeak guys to help us out when we first were getting started, because SilverPeak was sort of a little bit new to everybody and we needed a little bit of a push to get going. But I would certainly start out with your technical team, the technical relationship, because what we try and do, especially at Worldwide, is form a relationship with our technical advisors to help you roll out whatever solution that is best for you. And it may not be a specific vendor. It may be a hodgepodge of different vendors, but it really depends on what your needs are.
With that, Scott, number one, thank you for coming in today. Thank you for being part of the hands-on live lab. We've walked through several different aspects of live, so I invite everybody to enroll in the learning series and take some of the learning paths to get familiar with the Aruba solutions. And just general SD-Branch, if you search SD-Branch, there's several pieces of content. With that, on July 17th, we will be back for another hands-on live lab with Alex Nadimi to cover the Sierra data security platform. It should be interesting. I know absolutely nothing about data security, so I'm anxious to learn from the ground up with Alex. Another reminder is this recording will be placed on WWT.com in a couple days and eventually make its way to YouTube. As always, if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to connect through WWT.com. Ask any questions. With that, I greatly appreciate everybody's time. Have a great day. Thank you.